Some of the projects that the council has been involved in over the years, one large one in the early 1984 was the Supported Employment Initiative. At that time, supported employment was just beginning across this country. There were pieces of it going on in Oregon, in Washington State, some of the states that were much more progressive. I think maybe Virginia was another state where there were leadership that was going on there that created the supported employment notion. Well, the developmental disabilities at the federal level thought employment was and is a very important issue for people with disabilities, particularly for people with developmental disabilities, where jobs just were not plentiful or were not even considered for people with severe disabilities. And so they took on the initiative of supported employment. Well, Indiana got heavily involved in that. Supported employment was not very well known in terms of what is supported employment. So we held a statewide conference, brought in all the heavy hitters from across the country and had them present about supported employment to get a lot of enthusiasm and rallying point about let's do supported employment. It seems like the right thing to do. It seems like it would work. And then from the statewide conference, we held regional conferences because not everybody, of course, could come to the statewide conference. So we held regional conferences throughout the state. Presenting information about supported employment. And once we got that presented and people kind of excited about the whole notion about supported employment, that's when we started initiating these projects and programs. And then that's when we developed papers in terms of position papers, fact-finding papers and so forth that was presented to not only policymakers but also to the general public. And that again garnered some more support, and then through those efforts is when we were able then to go further and initiate this whole notion of the support for funding for supported employment. So that was one of the first initiatives that the council did in terms of some real systems change. Other areas we were heavily involved in was housing. We did a lot in the area of residential services. At the time that we were first around in the early 80s, the council was heavily involved in the funding of a lot of some studies that were done in supported living, as well as funding some projects, some initial projects. And one of the other things the council funded, of course, is when the ADA was initiated, or before it was initiated, the council was heavily involved, the staff was heavily involved in working toward organizing people with regard to the Americans with Disabilities Act and helping get it in passage of it. Going throughout the state, Justin Dart came in several times to do hearings and informational pieces, and we were very much part of those. Of that with helping to organize people coming to these forums, these public forums. Then once the ADA did pass, the council then funded a number of projects to educate people, particularly people with disabilities, about what does the ADA mean for you and how do you use it, and then also the advocacy work that goes along with that. You just don't, go in like a bull in a china shop to get something done. But how do you take a piece of legislation and public policy, and how do you get it implemented? We also did a really exciting initiative called Count Us In, and that was a whole initiative centered around the right to vote, people with disabilities having the right to vote, looking at the statistics, seeing that people with disabilities did not vote, very often, and taking a look at that and seeing what was some of the reasons, and some of the reasons were that some of the polling places were just not accessible to people. Plus the transportation, there's a lot of issues surrounding why people didn't vote. So we did a whole initiative centering around surveying every polling place in Indiana in real time. The Partners in Policymaking wasn't an initiative that we created. We have to give credit where it's due. Minnesota, Colleen Wick, who's a very talented, very skillful woman, very visionary, created this whole notion of partners in policy making, of people with disabilities being part of policy making decisions. And through her efforts, they created a project called Partners in Policy Making, where people with disabilities and family members were provided, actually applied to be part of this class. For like an 8-week, which expanded 8 months, and once a month, a weekend period, where they would come to their capital and learn about disability policy and the issues, and then also how to be an advocate. Because many, again, when you're looking at people with disabilities, and then when you look back in the 80s and 70s and 60s and where people came from out of institutions, many of them had never had the opportunity or chance to be an advocate or even know anything about advocacy. So this was training people how to be advocates to make for systems change. So the council got involved with that and did a number of those partners in policy making projects over a number of years. We also helped funded the self-advocates. We were the initial funders when it first started out in Fort Wayne, Indiana, in getting that started. And so there's a lot of things that the council was at the very forefront in helping to fund or get started and get organized, which is really, I think, really exciting when you go down through the years in terms of looking at all the things that the council has had its hands on and had responsibilities for.